Well, good afternoon, and thank you for coming to this event at the National Association of Scholars. This is an event that is not being live broadcast, but we are videotaping it, which means that if you stand up and say obstreperous things, we will cut it out. The National Association of Scholars, for those of you who are new to us, was founded in 1987. We are a reform-minded academic organization with about 4,000 members across the country. We operate in all 50 states. We have a staff of about 20 people, and this is our national office that you're currently sitting in. The purpose of the National Association of Scholars, as I said, is reform of higher education, but of course that word can be filled in to mean many different things. To us, it means that we are dedicated to making higher education something that takes as its core mission the advancement of liberal education, meaning the pursuit of truth, the ascension of intellectual freedom, and the cultivation of virtuous citizenship. Our mission statement says something about those three things. We are in the midst of something that's been going on for a very long time, which has been the shift in American higher education to ideological indoctrination in many ways. And the report that we are going to inaugurate today, titled Ideological Insistence, is one of now about, I was just trying to count them, 20 such reports that we've done over the years. I myself, I'm Peter Wood, the president of the organization, came into this subject with the publication of my first book in 2003 titled Diversity, the Invention of a Concept. And I have pretty much made my post-academic career as a critic of the diversity movement and its permutations. I was a tenured member of an anthropology department. I'm an academic PhD in my field and someone who knows higher education both as a faculty member and as an administrator. I was a college provost and the president's chief of staff at one research university. So we take our ideas of being the National Association of Scholars very seriously. We produce a lot of reports, some of them very hefty, but all of them we expect to be examined critically by an informed audience who will catch our mistakes. So we try to make very few of those, and when we do make them, we acknowledge them. I'll start by acknowledging one right now. There's a typo in the abstract of the little report, which you may have picked up as you come in on the executive summary, not the abstract, where it says in the third paragraph that 86 of the 95 American universities we investigated required diversity statements. We didn't examine 95 American universities, we examined 98. And if that's the only mistake that's in here, I will own it gladly. But we do want to be fastidious in trying to report the realities that we see. And we hire researchers who are really dedicated to this pursuit of truth. That is, we want to know what the facts are. We don't want to simply launch opinions out into the world about how bad things are or how we make them better if you only agreed with us. We expect disagreement. We disagree among ourselves frequently. You'll find some of that in our appropriately named quarterly journal, Academic Questions. It's not academic answers, it's academic questions. And we invite controversial opinions that cannot sometimes be published elsewhere in the academic press to appear in those pages. So it's a very lively journal. We don't stint on words. We just published a study of the U.S. Department of Education titled Wasteland. It came out pretty much in synchronization with the Trump administration's decision to end the Department of Education. That's not what we asked for. We were asking for fairly strenuous reforms in that department, but not its dissolution. I mention this because some of the things we've been saying lately make it sound like we have fallen deep in love with Donald Trump, and there's not a word he can say we disagree with. That's not true. He says many things we disagree with, but there are some things that he says that I take it are pretty germane to what we're doing today. He has issued, by latest count, 130 executive orders since his inauguration in this term. 7 of those deal with the issue of DEI, which, if you do your math, that's 5% of the executive orders are focused on getting DEI out of our institutions, not just colleges and universities, but also public schools, museums like the Smithsonian, and various agencies of the federal government that have been playing a major role in advancing the DEI agenda. DEI itself, the term, the diversity, equity, inclusion, goes back at least 25 years, maybe longer than that, but it didn't really land in public consciousness until our colleague Christopher Rufo over at the Manhattan Institute went on a campaign to relabel much of the agenda of the progressive left as DEI. And before that, our term of preference for it was the social justice movement. In fact, one of those long reports is titled Social Justice Education in America, which came out in 2019. So we've been on this topic. It's not new to us. And we have found many others who are attracted to the positions we've been taking, writing on the subject as well. Here's a report by one of our members, Larry Purdy, Getting Under the Skin of Diversity. Purdy was one of the attorneys who represented Barbara Grutter in the Grutter and Gratz cases that went to the Supreme Court in 2000. Well, the decision was handed down in 2003. So this is for us central territory, not at all peripheral to what we do. Let me mention what some of those 7 executive orders are that kind of govern our conversation at this point. Ending radical and wasteful government DEI programs, that was issued on January 20th. Defending women from gender ideology extremism and restating biological truth, that was also on January 20th. Ending illegal discrimination and restoring merit-based opportunity on January 21st. Ending radical indoctrination in K-12 education on January 29th. Additional measures to combat anti-Semitism on the 29th. Restoring truth and sanity to American history. That's Fix the Smithsonian Rule, which came out on March 27th. And most recently, just yesterday, we had Reforming Accreditation to Strengthen Higher Education. And if you read it, it's partly about DEI and the role of the regional accrediting associations in forcing DEI on colleges that may not even want it. And lastly, and probably most importantly, restoring equality of opportunity and meritocracy. Uncharacteristically, that one doesn't name what it's really about. What it's really about is ending disparate impact theory, which underlies a whole lot of what goes on in the diversity movement. Well, that's probably enough about us, although I'd be happy to take up further questions about that. Let me introduce the report by way of introducing its 2 authors, one, Louis Galarowicz, who's with us today, and the other, Mason Goad, who is somewhere in the deep south with a metal detector hunting for hidden gold. But Mason is our, I guess I can't call him resident genius because he's not resident, but he is a man of great curiosity and far-flung abilities. Without his research capacity, we would not have been able to execute this report. Louis is among our newest staff members who came in as a protege of John Seiler, who's now over at Manhattan Institute. They stole him away from us. But Lewis has picked up the reins that John let drop and has become an ace researcher specifically on a grant-funded project to examine how the DEI ideology and its counterparts have swept through American education. Now, what ideological insistence does is it looks at a snapshot, well, maybe not a snapshot, at least more like a daguerreotype. It took a while to develop it, of the job postings at American universities during a 2-month period from October and November of last year. We picked universities in 11 states and we added to those MIT and all 8 of the Ivy League universities, and just went through every job ad that they had, which includes staff as well as faculty members, with the question, to what degree do these job ads insist, that's our ideological insistence, that a viable candidate has a commitment to the diversity, equity, inclusion agenda? They don't all use the terms diversity, equity, inclusion, so there was some art in trying to figure out which of these did which. But the result here is something that sets a new standard. We uncovered, I won't waste time looking through the notes, but we went through thousands and thousands of job ads, and we've come up with a picture that I think documents a historical moment before the Trump administration called for the abolition of DEI. We got a chance to see just how deeply DEI is entrenched in American higher education. Now, some of this, I think, may sound like old news. Probably if you're here, you know that a heavy-handed insistence on conformity to the diversity doctrine, a demand that speech be tailored to the demands of this movement was widespread already. One thing that we uncovered is that by October and November of last year, this doctrine had begun to fade a little bit. Some institutions had already started to weed it out. Princeton, for example, seems to have decided that it was time to let go of this particular form of ideological insistence anyway. If you happen to have this document at hand and are looking at the puzzling circles, green and red circles that appear on almost every page, these are little charts that show for a given state, a given university, how much of the job ads relating to faculty or to staff, those are treated separately, are free of ideological insistence, and how much in the red category have they insisted that you agree with us or you don't get hired. So that's the simple way to read this document. Rather than invite a bunch of people to come and listen to an hour of statistics, we thought it might be a better idea to invite some experts, some people who have thought carefully about these matters at hand, and to see what they have to say about what's actually going on in higher education. They need not refer in any way at all to our work on this. There's plenty to be said apart from our publications, and we want to have a lively discussion. So let me introduce our 3 speakers. Nathan Honeycutt is a native of California with a BA in psychology from Cal Poly, an MA from San Diego State, and most importantly, a PhD from Rutgers. What makes that most important is that all 3 of our speakers here are rooted somehow in New Jersey. That's the only commonality I could really find. But Nathan is a key figure at FIRE, the Foundation for, I always want to go back to individual rights in education, but that's not what that stands for anymore. Can you help me out?
Expression.
Expression, okay. Well, FIRE and the National Association of Scholars are often on the same page, but not always. FIRE is known as a fearless defender of First Amendment freedoms and intellectual freedom. NAS is a more nuanced defender of intellectual freedom. We think higher education depends on things more than just free expression. The pursuit of truth gets in there too. And sometimes these core values can be in conflict with one another, and we have to search our way through that. But it's helpful to have one pure-hearted spirit who knows exactly what he wants out of higher education, and that will be part of our discussion. Next, we have Michael Regnier, who is a longtime member of Heterodox Academy. Heterodox is a youngin in our world, a more recent clustering together of academics, probably a little more centrist than NAS is. We're more center-right, but the purpose of Heterodox Academy, again, is to promote real intellectual freedom in a world where that has been vanishing. The role that Michael plays as, is it Director of Policy at Heterodox? Executive Director, puts him in a position to have a very good overview of what's going on here. His background includes, let me make sure I get this part right, your undergraduate degree is from Princeton. Mm-hmm. So there's your New Jersey connection.
That's right. We'll play some Springsteen later together.
Okay. And Joshua Katz, who is a member of the NAS board, was a professor of classics at Princeton for a long time until he got into Dutch with President Eisgruber and got sent away, that he landed on his feet at American Enterprise Institute, where he is now senior fellow.
That's right.
Thank you. Well, I think maybe the best way to proceed here is just to ask each of you for your take on the stand of American higher education at this moment on diversity, equity, inclusion. Is it coming or going, or are they going to stand and fight, or are they going to capitulate to the federal government?
Sure. Kick off with me?
Sure.
Well, I'm definitely the youngin in the group, so I don't have the years of experience in higher education and the long view. I guess what I see with higher education related to DEI is there's definitely a walking back. As Peter talked about, we've seen, in addition to MIT, University of Michigan, and then most recently the University of California system saying, hey, we probably need to step back from this and reevaluate. But part of me is a extreme skeptic at heart. And so I see these statements in University of Michigan, for example, or the University of California, and I pick up on little details. They're eliminating standalone DEI statements. So does that mean that, all right, well, faculty won't have to submit these standalone statements, but at Berkeley, they're advertising that they, back in the fall, they started saying, well, we want faculty to start incorporating DEI into their research statements, their teaching statements, their service statements. So are we going to go through a walking back and then a rebranding? The skeptical side of me says, I think that's a possibility. I mean, higher education has a lot of problems, as I think many in this room will recognize. Declining trust and confidence, chief among them, in addition to potentially impending enrollment cliff. And so they would do well to wake up, but time will tell. Mm-hmm. But just kind of kick it off, that's my thoughts.
So I think the rise of DEI as a concept has just been infuriating to those of us who try to keep track of concepts with crisp definitions, because it is just so slippery. If you say it's this, no, it's that. If you say it's that, no, it was this. And that makes it difficult. So I commend the team at NAS for putting some quantitative data around this slice of DEI. I think the deepest challenge that it has posed is the way in which it has invited faculty to become cynical to become transactional, performative, non-academic, in other words. And that has been the danger of the compelled speech versions of this, especially as some NAS staff and former staff have documented, when these statements have gone along with rubrics that sort of say, oh, are you an activist? You get a plus point. Oh, you want equal treatment? That's your definition of this undefined term. Then you get a minus point. It turns the academy sort of on its head as a place of seeking truth and debating and discussing important concepts out loud with each other rather than sort of behind closed doors. So I am heartened by the fact that DEI statements are on the wane, but I think that those cultural habits are going to take a long time to bring out into the light, criticize, discuss, and do away with. Hopefully, with a return to a focus on the academic project itself. That doesn't mean we don't still talk about diversity, arguments about equity, inclusion. These are important to be debating, but it's been a strange way of sort of making that a qualification to even enter the discussion. So hopefully, that'll continue to change.
So I agree with everything or nearly everything that my two colleagues have just said, and I'd like to piggyback on what both of them did have to say. So first of all, it's very hard to know whether things are going up or down or sideways when you can't define these terms. These terms are indeed extremely slippery. In principle, there's nothing wrong with diversity. That's something one can discuss. In principle, it's not wrong to be inclusive, at least in some environments. I will say equity is the only thing I disagree with. I mean, I don't understand what equity could possibly mean outside things like equity markets, which is not what this is. So aside from this, diversity and inclusion are maybe in principle okay, and one could talk about those sorts of things. But indeed, as Michael just said, if somebody says one thing and then it gets challenged, well, it's slippery, moves over in a slightly different direction. So up, down, sideways, it depends on what's going on. Now, Nathan said, I think entirely correctly, that the whole notion of statements can change, right? So is it this kind of statement or another kind of statement? But the problem is much larger than this. I don't really want to spend my time talking about Princeton, but since Peter says we're all talking about New Jersey, and since he brought up Princeton a couple of times, it's worth noting that a striking feature of this report is that Princeton is an outlier, apparently at the moment in the Ivy League, in having in October and November 2024 essentially no job ads that had DEI statements. There was one out of, I think, 191. By comparison, in exactly that same period, 100% of job ads at Dartmouth had these statements, 82% at Cornell, 80% at Brown, and so on. So Princeton had essentially zero. And yet, if you've been following the news, you know that Princeton is, as the president himself admitted, a hotbed of systemic racism. So DEI statements, in whatever form they may be, are, of course, a very important part of this picture, but they're only, however you define statements, just one part of a much, much larger whole. One last comment on this. Peter mentioned Chris Rufo. So Chris Rufo published in City Journal, along with Ryan Thorpe 2 days ago, a little piece on Princeton, in which he pointed out that in 2021, Princeton issued a public statement. I remember when this came out, I read it at the time, about so-called supplier diversity. Supplier diversity has to do not with job ads exactly, but who supplies the paper towels, who supplies the cleaning fluids, who supplies the hamburgers, and so on and so forth. And Princeton made a concerted and public effort to say, we're going to hire suppliers on the basis not of cost, not of quality, but of race. Well, here we are today talking about statements, but unfortunately, it's very hard to know whether things are going again up or down or sideways when statements are just one part of a much, much larger whole.
I'd like to spend a few minutes doing some exhumation of history. You had mentioned, Michael, that this was a long time coming. Well, how did we get here? How did this movement establish itself so deeply in the bloodstream of American higher education?
Well, I think that sweeping history has had a few people narrate it in different ways. On the topic of diversity statements, though, I think there's consensus that the roots were in the state of California, which passed a referendum banning racial preferences in hiring. And as a result, there was a new innovation, which was sort of as a proxy or a sidestep. You could ask for how you would contribute to diversity on campus, I think is how it was originally phrased, which is very, we might say, artful. Because you could drop hints about an identity that they were not allowed to ask you about, but also it came to mean, a certain way of signaling. Were you in support of a cause that has gone by a lot of names, including social justice? But that became popular. It became a popular move. In fact, the Berkeley version of the rubric for evaluating those statements was widely adopted all over the country. So I think it was a story about a local difference between sort of the will of the voters and the desires of campus administrators that created a best practice. And one thing that we know, for good or for ill, about higher education is that people don't like to be original very much. There's a strong sense of isomorphism. Something happens here, it becomes easy to defend. It becomes the safe move. They're doing it at Berkeley, we're doing it here. It's just the best practice. It's interesting now to see how best practice is quickly shifting, and that risk aversion, that sense of going with the crowd, might be driving people in the other direction. But I think that particular controversy was certainly part of it. I will leave to others the big, broader cultural narrative.
Let me take that back to Joshua right away. Michael's account puts a lot of the weight on these duplicitous administrators who were figuring out how to game the system after Proposition 209 passed in California. You have lived experience with those administrators. Are they wholly to blame, mainly to blame, or would you apportion some of the blame off to faculty or students or both?
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear you use the term lived experience, but other than that, excellent question. Yeah, you mean specifically about the statements? Is that right?
Well,
because at this point, everybody is responsible for some of the trouble. I mean, it used to be the case, not all that long ago, when people would say, I think with great justification, that problems of this kind were coming top down. And more recently, there's been a great deal of evidence that it's going bottom up. That is to say that the students, indeed, even entering undergraduate freshmen, are the sorts of people who scare the daylights out of the high administrators who then kowtow to them. At different places in different years, the balance is going to be different. But at the moment, we have a situation in which administrators are afraid of students, faculty are afraid of students, faculty are often afraid of administrators. Pretty much everybody is afraid of everybody else. And that's because in any given point, different kinds of people have power. So, ultimately, of course, this is down to the senior administrators, and indeed, though this often goes unmentioned, the trustees, who are the senior administrators on top of the senior administrators, but who by and large just rubber stamp stuff instead of actually doing their duty and their due diligence. But really, I think one would have to give a much more fine-grained answer to who's responsible. Fundamentally, everybody's responsible. I've seen students be responsible. Responsible in a bad way. I've seen faculty be responsible in a bad way. I've seen administrators and trustees be responsible. I should say also, I was on the faculty at Princeton for almost 25 years, and I don't want to make an ice grouper-like claim that I am responsible for Princeton's alleged systemic racism or anything like this, but it is certainly the case that even I was sometimes in rooms where things were done and I decided, look, it wasn't worth my time. It wasn't worth my life to complain about one little thing or not. And that's not a good thing to admit, but essentially everybody in the academy who had any power whatsoever would have to admit that once in a while, he or she did the sorts of things that have created the situation we're in now.
Nathan, you are self-confessed the youngest here. You got an undergraduate degree from Cal Poly, which in my world is maybe not the worst, but somewhere in running. So
Thank you. You going to stand for that?
Well, and so the issue here is that you came of age when diversity was settled doctrine. There was really no capacity at some point to question whether diversity is the lodestar of higher education. It just is, and it was everywhere. So what was your experience, and how did you find your way into being a critic of it?
Yeah, I would challenge the notion about Cal Poly, because I think the agriculture and the engineering focus of the school does draw it back a little bit. I think since I've left there, it's turned a bit. I suppose personally, the way that I approached it is I started designing studies where I studied political diversity and discrimination. Like, okay, well, if this is all in the rage, let's talk about actual diversity problems on campus as I saw them. So when I look at the breakdown of faculty, it's like, well, yes, there are a lot of groups that are underrepresented, but conservatives and moderates or independents are often the most underrepresented. But I guess personally, my experience is I kind of carved out an area where I was somewhat disconnected for it. But I will agree with Joshua that I think all are complicit in it. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind for me is I think a lot of times with these initiatives, it does come from the top down to a degree. But when I think about California and the University of California system, which has really championed a lot of this, the faculty there very quickly took the reins very early on, critiquing the DEI statement effort, saying, hey, if this is coming from administrators from the top down, we like this, but that's the wrong way to do it. And so they very quickly took control and like, okay, we want to push this, but we want to push it on behalf of the faculty. So faculty saying that we should do this or not. And so I think as those things have switched, I mean, now we see kind of top-down administration saying, no, we're not going to do this anymore. And when I've surveyed faculty on this topic, over half of faculty generally say that they don't think DEI statements are a good thing, but we're still just hovering around that 50%. So there's still a large margin there who are in support of them.
Well, I don't want to be overly focused on just diversity statements. That happened to be what this particular study was about, but DEI is a lot more than statements. It involves other factors. We're taking a look at what some of those are. Michael, what would you recommend to be the best metric to get at the level at which DEI is now in an entrenched orthodoxy in higher education?
Well, I don't know if there's one metric, but I think you can triangulate a little bit. When you think about a campus that, again, has its focus on an academic mission, you would not expect, first of all, non-faculty to be kind of encroaching on teaching students about the world and about social questions and controversies in a way that you often do see. So the role of this, some have called it a shadow curriculum or a parallel educational system on many big campuses, is something that I think is a real tell. These are very often, not always, but often very well-intentioned people who view it as their job not to be involved in truth seeking, but to make the campus feel like home, to make it feel welcoming. That's helpful and useful to a certain extent. But at some campuses, it's it's gone off to the rails to the point that faculty are a pretty small input into the student experience. And instead, from your residential advisor to the folks running freshman orientation to the people adjudicating conflicts among students, there's the sense that all those big controversial questions are pretty much obvious. They're settled. We could tell you on day one who are the good guys, who are the bad guys, but we're here to enact that ideology. What a loss for the idea of a college education. When the faculty who are trained and disagree with one another and are examples of academic discourse become kind of an afterthought and really not the main message that you receive from the institution. So that's one. I think institutional commitments, I think hiring practices in detail. I think the way that viewpoint diversity is considered or not, oftentimes there's a little fig leaf of a reference to viewpoint diversity, but taking that seriously or not is an important tell. I wish I had an all-encompassing metric, though I don't think I do.
Have you ever, say, Joshua, been subject to implicit bias training?
Well, in my present job at the American Enterprise Institute, emphatically not. At Princeton, I suppose, at least in the later years, every year there was an online, thing that one had to fill out, and it would take, 26 minutes of your time to go through scenarios of, John does this to Frank. Is it A, bad, B, good? And then you have to check it, that sort of thing. And some of that had implicit bias stuff in it. Aside from that, at the university level, the answer was no. On the department level, it's a little bit more complicated. I was very fortunate that I was on sabbatical the first time a group called, I think it's called Race Forward, I'm not sure now, a race training group was brought into the classics department on, I believe, a Friday. And the entire day, the entire faculty was, I believe, required to show up. But fortunately, I was in another country, so I was not required to show up. But had I been there, I would have been required to show up and spend the entire day, 8:30 to 4 or something like this, being lectured to by people who not only are not the academics at the university, a very serious problem that Michael just alluded to, but are non-academics not at the university lecturing the faculty on what to do, including, I should say, making us think about how we can incorporate DEI not only in our teaching, but also in our scholarship. I mean, I know this because, of course, I received, since I couldn't be there, a report afterwards telling me all the things that I was supposed to do. The idea that non-academics, not even at the university, were telling professors at the university to incorporate DEI in their scholarship. Yeah, well, that's at that point, things are over. Anyway, other people have had, I think, much more implicit bias training to deal with than I have, I'm glad to say.
It sounds like you have a great deal of white fragility.
I mean, I'm half Jewish. Do I count? I don't even know. I take it that's the white problem. I mean, I think one thing nobody could accuse me of is being fragile.
Okay. I asked about implicit bias training because that's sort of next up on Louis Galarowicz's agenda for examining DEI. So we are looking at required training programs at universities around the country. What is implicit bias?
Yeah, so I actually teach psychology as an adjunct professor at the University of Arkansas. And I was just going through this last week with my students, a unit on social psychology. And I have one slide about implicit bias because As a social psychologist trained by Lee Jessamine at Rutgers, I'm not a fan of implicit bias, as you could imagine. So I tell my students that basically it's subtle bias or prejudice that researchers believe that a person could have that they might not be consciously aware of. But, and then I say, here's the link to a video if you want to watch it. I don't talk about it anymore because basically you can't replicate any of this stuff. What is implicit bias at all? I mean, it's in the United States, it's a multi-million or billion-dollar industry going around training people on these subtle things that you need to be aware of, how you might implicitly think that men are better than women in this discipline, or white people are better than non-whites in this area or that area. So it's a very interesting academic question, but one that we should not be training people on without substantially further investigation.
Let me go a little further than that on your doubt. Your doubts about, this isn't going to work until I get my voice back. But, what I wanted to ask is there some way to chase implicit bias out of the academy because it's not a reputable, replicatable scientific approach without getting crosswise with academic freedom?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll think. Let me let you guys jump in first, and then circle back to me.
I think to the extent that the problem of this concept is not that someone in academia is wrong, but rather that it's embedded in mandatory trainings. I don't think the content of those trainings is subject to academic freedom. So you could certainly remove that as a matter of institutional policy, and you should, because we shouldn't be teaching things that don't have an evidence base, and that can have a kind of pernicious effect. But I certainly wouldn't favor some kind of special policy on that academic concept. If somebody wants to run another study, maybe they'll find some evidence of support, would be my sense. There are these concepts that seem to linger around, though. In K-12 education, there's an idea about learning styles. People have different ideas about left brain and right brain. Even when the studies don't come in, they seem to kind of linger sometimes. So maybe administrators can do something to sort of, as you do, say, hey, you may have heard of this. Turns out it doesn't replicate, and that's part of what we do around here.
One other thought I have on it too. Lee Jessamine and I have written some papers where we talk. I don't know if we've explicitly used the term, but we talked about kind of dead horse theories. So these theories that have been whipped and they should be dead, but the horse is still up trotting around. And implicit bias falls in that category. Microaggressions falls in that category. Gender bias in STEM falls in that category. And so even though there's growing mountains of evidence that these things aren't really what they seem, people conveniently ignore that. And sometimes it's like, well, if you're writing a paper, you can't cite everything. So you're not going to cite all the literature, especially that's against whatever you're trying to publish or write about. But academics are really good at conveniently ignoring things that don't agree with their worldview or the ideas or the theories that they have. And I think implicit bias often, again, if I'm bringing back the cynical side of me, it's something that's really easy to say, okay, well, we got to do something about diversity or something under the DEI umbrella. Let's just do this training. It's just a quick, easy, check the box, make everybody do it, and then we can move on with our lives and without kind of thinking through the pernicious side effects.
Well, there are surely things that are true but are not replicable. That if something has been subject to repeated study for a long time and failed every reasonable test in given discipline, one would think that its persistence is then a problem that itself needs to be understood. Most people would call that persistence not just stubbornness, but an ideology, that one is committed to something irrational. Now, that comes into this discussion because we now have a whole series of executive orders that essentially say, if it's ideological, you can't teach it, or if you want to teach it, at least you're not going to get federal research funding. So we're back into the world of executive orders. Are those well-founded in your view, or is this an overreach on the part of the government?
Speaking, I guess, from FIRE's position, it depends. So if it's telling faculty that thou shalt not teach on these topics, that's moving into a realm that's too far. And because you're starting to get into territory where you're mandating what is or is not appropriate. And if the tables are turned, then what's to say that the other side won't use that power to all of a sudden carve out other things to be out of bounds? Now, if it's saying that you can't have certain programs, or there's not going to be funding towards certain things, or if it's saying like you need to eliminate ideological litmus tests like DEI statements, I think those are, I would say those are appropriate moves. But you have to be careful, and this is where FIRE has gotten flack from those on the right when it comes to Florida. The Florida legislature has, in its attempts to go after DEI, has often said like, hey, you can't teach or talk about these things. And it's like, that's getting into academic freedom territory.
Same question, Joshua.
Well, I'm going to once again piggyback on what Michael said about the difficulty of defining terms. So I agree, I think, with essentially everything that Nathan said. But I'll add to this, just again, something that Michael's already said and that I've already said too, which is that if you don't know exactly what diversity means or is supposed to mean, and what inclusion means and is supposed to mean, and what equity, God help us, means at all, then it's very difficult sometimes to know what compliance or non-compliance with a given order would actually mean, never mind whether the order is actually going to pass the courts. I think maybe
let's bring it down to a specific. In this class, we consider men who were assigned male category at birth, but who later decide that they are actually women, are truly, really women. Mm-hmm. And you will get a failing grade in this class if you use the wrong pronoun or fail to show due respect to the trans women in the class. That's pretty specific. Either they are or they aren't. And in my class, they are. And you better live with it. Is that a fair thing in the name of academic freedom to allow?
I would say that in a class, well, first of all, is the class about these questions, or is the class about?
The class is about Herodotus.
The class is about Herodotus, and somehow or other, we're now worrying about who's a man and who's a woman in the class. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I am wholly unsympathetic to laws that require people to give their pronouns, use the pronouns, quote unquote, correctly of other people, and so on and so forth. We can certainly have a conversation about the difference between what it means to be legal and what it means to be, quote unquote, polite. But I myself have no tolerance whatsoever for the idea that you could possibly punish somebody for misusing a pronoun or something like that in class.
I think that's the wrong end of the stick. The question has to do with, can the faculty member who's teaching the class legitimately establish these rules and say, it's my academic freedom that in my class these rules pertain, and if you don't like it, that's tough.
Yeah, I believe the answer to that is that a professor cannot do that because, among other things, it requires students and presumably other people also to engage in compelled speech. And this compelled speech can also, I think, legitimately be argued against on all sorts of grounds, religious and otherwise. But compelled speech is a very bad thing, and compelled speech, especially when the people in question actually start parroting things that they don't themselves believe, is a really, really bad thing. So no, I don't think that should be allowed.
Michael, are there any occasions in which you would support compelled speech?
In a word, no. I do think on the larger question, there are some dangers to look out for here, and I'll mention two of them. One is that I think the right should be extremely careful not to replicate that strategic slipperiness that it has seen on the left. And I say strategic because it can be very helpful to sort of imply one thing but rely on something else when it comes to the law. And I am concerned that in enforcing anti-discrimination laws, which have been unenforced and must be aggressively enforced, there is sort of some room for some winks and nods about what actually I think it's referred to as discriminatory DEI means. Does that mean teaching about women, teaching about racial minorities at all? What does DEI mean? If we didn't know before, we kind of still don't know. And so putting the force of law around that without being very careful to say, we're talking about discrimination here as defined under law, can create some of the same chilling effects that my organization has documented for many years coming from the other side. The other thing that I would just caution all of us to think about is it's not just about laws here. These are universities. The report cites the AAUP declaration from 1915, which talks extensively about duties, which you cannot always enforce, but are still very important. To not turn yourself into a propagandist, to not abuse your authority over students, it even talks about not pushing your political views into the heads of intellectually immature college students. I think if we had a lot more talk about the duty side, we would have a healthier academy.
I think it's wonderful that you bring up the 1915 AAUP statement. We've been championing that for our 40 years or so, but the AAUP hasn't. 1940 statement, which superseded the 1950 statement, eliminates any language about duties. And it's been revised several times since then to take it even further away from the responsibilities that come with the supposed rights of academic freedom.
Yeah.
So it's a dead letter at this point.
Well, I'd like to bring it back to life. We can try to resurrect it. I think that what was the genius about that 1915 statement was it really had a consciousness of the social bargain between academia and the rest of society. There have been think piece after think piece written in these last few weeks about that same idea because people are suddenly remembering that taxpayers are actually involved in these institutions, that voters are involved, that parents are involved. And so, I think we tend to forget over time. People become complacent. It's time for a new conversation about not just rights, but duties. And, I think that's happening, whether it was planned or not.
I'm all in favor of the duties part of this discussion that has been set aside, but I also worry about what's happened with the standard of truthfulness. The 1915 statement's a little bit artful about that, but it puts its emphasis on science and says that you have to abide by the standards of truthfulness within your discipline. That too has gone AWOL. We are in an era in which the truthiness is set aside in favor of postmodern ideas about consensus or agreement within an area that can sometimes swing very wide of what I think reasonable people would say is a standard for accuracy and truthfulness. Nathan.
I'm not sure how to respond or how to quibble with that, but to say that we live in an era where people would rather speak their truth than have an established universal truth, and that isn't helpful or constructive in many of those situations.
Well, what I'm trying to do is force into the open here some of the distance between FIRE and NAS, and that we think you guys turn your backs on the truth. You're so eager to maintain the freedom of speech that they're perfectly willing to countenance knowing liars in declarations that are plainly false, because you see a higher good in not getting in the way of the liberty of the faculty member to say or do what he wants. So, how do you think?
I believe that sunlight is the best disinfectant. I think if there are liars and people speaking the truth and spreading falsehoods, that the best way to respond to that is by speaking even more vociferously what the truth is. That if we start shutting down people because what they're saying is a lie, I think oftentimes when you start to do that, then you force these views underground. And then when they're underground, they fester, they grow, and they can't really be dealt with. Whereas out in the open, they can be shut down explicitly. So we would say sunlight's the best.
Well, Columbia did a bang-up job of putting sunlight on the people who were demonstrating in favor of Hamas and massacring Israelis and treating the nation of Israel as a settler colonial project that needs to be cleared from the land. That lots and lots of sunlight. Didn't seem to me that we saw much recognition there of the truth of the matter.
Yeah, at least not immediately. I think what we're seeing at Columbia is that some positions and some views have been so entrenched that it's going to take some time to deal with it. And I think what Columbia is experiencing, that many faculty would say is probably unfortunate, is now because they haven't dealt with their house internally, external forces are coming in to deal with them. And so I think Columbia and perhaps Harvard and other institutions can stand as a wake-up call to universities like, hey, if you believe in these principles, if you believe in the local control, if you believe in academic freedom, get your house in order before someone else has to come in and do it for you. You have many legislatures, a lot of legislators and red-leaning states that have seen problems and they see faculty not doing anything about it. So then they feel compelled to have to step in. If you guys can't deal with this, we're going to deal with it for you. So hopefully faculty will become an administrative motivated to address issues before it has to do that. Because oftentimes then when you have these outside forces stepping in, they overstep.
Well, we've had enough of Princeton, so let's turn to Harvard. Harvard has the capacity to brush aside Donald Trump's interventions.
I don't believe that, actually.
Well, I agree. There's a case here that Harvard may not be able to do that, but if it wants to mortgage its Cambridge property and issue bonds, just issued one for, is it $450 million?
Yeah, it can manage for a few years if it has to.
It can manage for a while. So, but let's say they're in for the long fight. They are announcing their position in terms of defense of their academic freedom, meaning not just faculty members' academic freedom, but the institution's academic freedom. And they're doing that in the midst of what at least a fair number of observers think is entrenched anti-Semitism. So in my world, the pursuit of truth about the situation in Israel and the Middle East ought to trump that academic freedom. Say you?
That's me.
Yes. Didn't promise an easy
I have said a lot of negative. I've written a lot of negative things about Harvard in recent years, but I can't say that I think that this is Harvard's worst moment. I'm of course not answering your question. I'm punting on it, but this is not, in my view, the greatest month to be going after Harvard. I think that after the Claudine Gay debacle, there is now a well-meaning, intelligent, emphatically not Jew-hating president who, if only he could allow his secretive corporation, of which, of course, he is ex officio a member, to run things properly, could actually potentially put the house a little bit more in order than has happened before. So I agree with what Nathan was just saying about Colombia, to the extent that I think that a lot of what President Trump is doing, the shock and awe factors, will have an effect on, institutions, including Harvard and others, to the effect of making them wake up and clean up their own house before even worse things happen. But compared to some other places, I actually think that Harvard has done a reasonably good job under very difficult circumstances in the last couple of weeks of attempting to maintain order. Of course, we have no idea what's now going to happen, and I could be proved entirely wrong about this, but it's not as though I'm in favor of Harvard as an institution. I mean, I do have a degree from there, but okay, that's neither good nor bad. I'm not in favor of it as such as an institution. I am certainly not in favor of wildly entrenched anti-Semitism, but I'm also not in favor of accidentally or not accidentally killing off billions of dollars of actually important grants, as opposed to the grants that are just junk that go to stupid people. So on balance, I'm not really answering your question, but this is not the moment at which I am going to give the harshest criticism to Harvard.
Okay.
Boy, okay, go at me again. I know you hated that answer.
I'm going to see what Michael has to say about the matter.
Well, I think you were using academic freedom in the institutional term, and I think it's worth breaking that out. Our view would be that preserving a culture of academic freedom within the university is critical, and that there is actually not an orthodox truth that is outside of that process of challenge, and that there should not be, including any particular view on what's happening in the Middle East. There are certainly a host of opinions that we will someday know were wrong, and we may be pretty sure they're wrong right now. But the whole thing doesn't work if there are taboos built in. Now, that's different than the actual experience of students on campus. I think our law does a pretty good job of trying to distinguish between what is harassment, what is violence, what is intimidation. There's certainly some judgment calls there, but no student at Harvard or anywhere else should have to, run a gauntlet or have certain pathways they can't take on campus or deal with abuse as a condition of being on campus. I don't think we have to choose between censorship and safety. I think it's possible to have, or rather, open inquiry and safety. I think it's possible to have both. Harvard seems to have been a place that developed a whole bunch of bad habits, where you could take over a building and the administrators would bring you a burrito in one case, and I don't mind the fact that there's a whole lot of introspection going on right now. However, there's also, if we're going to rely on the law, I think we need to rely on the law. So I think that the courts will be weighing in to see whether the law was, in fact, applied in the correct way. And I think that'll be pretty illustrative for a lot of other campuses looking on.
Well, let's shift from the law to culture. I'm an anthropologist, and you say you don't have to choose between open inquiry and censorship. No, you don't. But
I'm sorry, I was saying you don't have to choose between open inquiry and safety.
Oh, safety.
In other words, physical safety, yes. Intellectual safety is another matter, but physical safety.
Right. Okay. Thanks for the correction. But what I would say is that American higher education, coast to coast, with a few little archipelagos of exceptions, is dominated by a single culture, one in which all the important questions are pre-answered. When you arrive on campus as a freshman, there are probably, any one of us could sit down in a few minutes, come up with a list of 20 things which everybody believes. And to dissent from that is dangerous. It's dangerous not because you're going to be hit over the head with a club or called a bad name, but because you're going to be setting yourself apart from the community in which you've come to spend the next 4 years, ideally, and you will be socially isolated. You will be subject to a kind of derision that is just all around you all the time. Now, that's the reality of American higher education today. There are students who are made of tough enough stuff that they can endure it and develop their own character and minds within that environment, but they are the exception. The rule is that after 4 years, or in the case of public universities, oftentimes 6 years, what you come out with is someone who's been formed, standardized to a particular worldview that, whether we want to call it DEI inflected or something else, certainly represents a basic hostility to our traditional nation and its culture, and a kind of dim view of the West as a whole, including our history all the way back to ancient times. That seems to me to be a problem that neither Heterodox Academy nor FIRE can get hold of. That is, that if we want to reform this system, you have to find some way to break into that culture and change it. Your view?
I don't think I agree with your premise, Peter. I think if you go to many universities and talk to many students, you will find an element of what you've described. There's a certain hothouse culture in parts of the academy, certain departments, certain subgroups of students and faculty. But, I watch college football. I don't think all of those fans in the stands are, reading Foucault every night. I think there are reasons to be alarmed, and there are reasons to have our views on whether these institutions are serving the public interest. I respect and very often agree with NAS's take on that. But I don't think that it is the case that this is inescapable on every campus. We have 74 campus communities right now, from a community college in Oregon to small Christian private schools in the South to, major, Midwest, Big Ten type of schools. And everyone says it kind of varies. So I'm also happy to concede that there's a lot that's outside of Heterodox Academy's mission, and that's why we have multiple organizations, and I think that's good and fine. But I think we should be a little bit wary of feeling like the sky is falling all the time. Those of us who are on Twitter looking at the worst cases as they pop up can be tempted to doom. I think there's hope out there as well, and some institutions that are very admirable. So that's my take.
Yeah. So I basically agree with that. And I am a pessimist in all possible ways. So I think I agree with Peter that campuses have gone completely to hell. But I agree with Michael that the problem is not as bad, in fact, as that it's just gone to hell. How is this possible? That's a contradiction. And the simple answer is that not many years ago, most people on campus, most students, most members of the faculty really didn't care very much about most of this stuff. And somehow or other, magically, some very, very loud voices have hijacked everything. That's how they have gone to hell. But most people, at least half a generation ago, were more or less reasonable. And now somehow or other, magically, they're no longer reasonable, but they could be made to be reasonable again. It's the fringe people who are causing complete havoc. And to my surprise, and I would say the surprise of most people who have been paying attention, that fringe has seriously infected not just the people who were closest to the fringe, but the very, very large center. If we can get that back, and I think the current certain efforts of the current administration may be able to get that back, paradoxically. If we can get that back, then I think we can return to campuses, which may very well not be to Peter's liking and may not be largely to my liking either, but will not, in fact, be the hellholes that they often seem to be and that the media present them regularly to be.
Peter, shall we go to Q&A? I don't think you guys are done with the slide questions.
Okay, well, let me. You were going to say something.
I just want to jump in real quick on that too. To say I agree with both of you. And as you're talking, I'm thinking about FIRE's data. So we have, years of data showing the rates of self-censorship among students, how it's particularly higher among conservative students, how there are so many hot button issues. So lately it's been the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where students feel like they can't speak openly and honestly, or abortion, or in the South, gun control. And it's similar among faculty. And FIRE, in partnership with some other individuals, we are doing a survey of faculty who are in our Scholars Under Fire database. And reading through some of the open-ended comments from some of these faculty members, it's like these instances where they stood up against or were vocal or kind of stepped on a landmine of some sort. Like it was highly traumatic for so many of them. And just kind of recounting, just reading like what they dealt with, it's like, yeah, this stuff is really bad. But I think we're seeing, and what I have to talk about is like, I wish more faculty had courage. And I'm starting to see more who have courage and who will say, no, I'm not going to do that, or who will speak out in support of their colleague, or who won't do this, that, or the other. And so I'm pessimistic, I'm skeptical, but I see some opportunities for some optimism.
And I hasten to add, there are widespread cultural problems. Mm-hmm. Faculty who have to choose between being a very courageous person and paying the price, or putting their head down and not pursuing the truth in a wholehearted way. That is a tragedy across the board. But I do think that that's not everyone on campus. And for that reason, it's possible to come together and continue to bring back the ideals that we want.
Yeah. And there's such a temptation too. And this is often when I see student groups on campus, there's such a temptation to play the card of the victim. And conservatives are in a minority among faculty, and conservative students have a hard time on campus. But I think it does more of a disservice when they play the victim card instead of just being vocal in defense of what they think. But yeah, well.
Okay, well, no victims here. I'm just going to ask one more question for the whole panel. We've been talking about higher education more broadly, but whatever higher education has been doing over the last couple generations has certainly seeped out into the broader society. Some of that gives me cause for hope. The Snow White bombed in the box office. The Disney world of all woke all the time is turning out to be a very bad business model. Many corporations, after their excited declarations of systemic racism following the death of George Floyd in custody, including higher education, but not just, have discovered that they are ready to go back into the mainstream. Now, it doesn't sound from things I've been saying for the last few minutes like I'm a starry-eyed optimist, but actually I'm pretty optimistic about American culture right now, as in it's had enough of the guff that higher education has been handing out. The public is demanding change. We're seeing that in the cratering of enrollment in public universities and small colleges around the country. We're seeing it in the defection of young men from higher education who want none of the feminist crap that they're fed there if they go. So all of these point to, in my mind, to a kind of American Renaissance, which Donald Trump might be assisting via executive orders, but it's not just him. There is a kind of fed upness in American life now, which points in a very positive direction, I think, towards that freedom of expression, which FIRE wants, that intellectual openness that Heterodox Academy wants, and that pursuit of truth that the National Association of Scholars wants. So I'll leave the last words to each of you.
Well, I'll start if that's okay. And here I won't speak for HXA because this is an issue where we haven't taken a position. But, I think that there is a great opportunity to build right now. And I will say that personally speaking, I really appreciated the administration's recent executive order on accreditation reform, because I'm very hopeful that it will open the doors to make it easier to start colleges and universities or take over them and turn them around. The role of the accreditor has not delivered quality, but it has sometimes encouraged uniformity or ideology. But talking to folks who have attempted to start a new college, such as UATX or Ralston College or others, it's really a catch-22. You can't receive, students who have federal loans until you're accredited, but you can't be accredited until you've been operating for a number of years. So it puts sort of the incumbents in an advantageous position. And I think in America, you want to see more innovation. We have to figure out what higher ed does with AI. We have to figure out how, as our economy changes, how higher education can deal with that. And also, many of us have an interest in bringing back an educational experience that has been lost. So there's folks working on classical schools, all kinds of innovative models. I think it should be easier to do that, to compete with the existing colleges and universities and maybe, put some pressure on them and deliver some new experiences. So, there is a lot of reform. My group tries to do reform, many of us around the table. But, we should be able to build some alternatives as well. I think that's a healthy part of the mix. And that does give me some hope.
Well, maybe I'll take my last comment as an opportunity to return more generally to the idea of diversity statements, which in a sense is why we're all here today. One of the most interesting things about this report is that although it is about universities, it is not only or even close to only about just faculty members. It's about jobs in universities generally, including many, many jobs that have nothing whatsoever to do with academic freedom. They have to do perhaps with free speech in the sense that everybody at a public university, and indeed everybody generally in the public, has First Amendment rights, but academic freedom is a special other case. But the 23,000 jobs that the NAS just looked at include all sorts of other things. They just happen to be at universities. So, for example, quote, at Cornell, even staff roles such as plumber journeyman and radiation safety specialist have as their first required qualification, quote, experience in and or demonstrated commitment to supporting diversity, equity, access, inclusion, and well-being, and as their second, quote, ability to cultivate and develop inclusive and equitable working relationships. My favorite footnote in this report, National Association of Scholars, comma, plumber journey person, comma, Cornell _102 HTML, et cetera. The point of this is that although the NAS and the people on this panel are primarily concerned with faculty members and with students, the fact is that there are lots of people at colleges and universities with what one might call normal jobs, members of the regular public, the, as it were, Disney public and everything else. And I'll be very interested to see how the sorts of things that are happening at universities now do and do not end up affecting, well, the staff, the people who are actually affected by, for example, Princeton's supplier diversity initiative and so on and so forth. It'll be very interesting to see where that sort of thing goes. So yeah, I in general am also relatively optimistic about where American culture generally is going. But let's watch what happens at the universities very broadly. Let's watch what happens to the staff members who are assaulted by students and faculty members who enter buildings and then perhaps get burritos. Let's see what actually happens to the plumbers as well. Let's see who ends up getting the contracts for things like the cleaning fluid. We'll see.
I think similar to heterodox, this is a bit outside of Fire's purview, but just speaking for myself, I think I'm somewhat optimistic because when I look at, and I often throw in surveys, questions about confidence and trust in higher education. And it's not that I'm excited about the public's trust and confidence in higher education dropping, but I'm seeing it dropping. And I believe that's correlated with additional awareness about what's going on these campuses. I think post-October 7th, the encampments, the public was really awakened, like, oh, this is what's going on a lot of campuses, and they're not happy about it. So I'm optimistic that this awareness will lead to positive reforms. And what often happens on campuses is, as a sort of testing ground, trickles out to corporate America and to K-12 education and other dynamics. And so hopefully that flow will be turned around.
Well, thank you, all of you. And we have a little bit of time for questions. Okay, are we using microphones for questions or not?
Yeah, so if anyone from the audience has a question, please ask it. It'll be repeated again through the microphones, just so that we have a clear recording.
It would be also helpful to state your name unless you don't want to. Tom?
My name is Tom. I'm happy to state my name. Joshua, were the trustees involved at all in your case? Did any trustees personally come to you? Do you know any trustees? And the larger question is, my job is to fit as many questions in one as I can, but the larger question is there any chance in hell that the trustees would take back the authority that they actually have over education, but as a matter of practice, don't exercise?
Right. Okay. If I fail to answer any parts of that, please call me on it. Yes, the trustees were emphatically involved in what you euphemistically call my case. That is to say, the trustees were the ones who, after all, rubber stamped my being fired. So yes. Second,
rubber stamp? I mean, they rubber stamped him, but were they involved in any substantive way?
I don't suppose I have any way of really knowing that. I mean, that is to say, there were at least supposedly meetings of both a subcommittee of trustees and the full set of trustees, but I couldn't tell you how many, if any of them, read what documents or what percentage of documents or that sort of thing. I have no idea what the answer to that is. Did any trustees come to me? No trustees no people who were trustees at the time came to me. Lots of people who were former trustees came to me, and lots of people who are friends of former trustees, and indeed at the time present trustees, came to me with various kinds of secret messages. But no member of the board of trustees at the time talked to me directly. The third question was, do I know any of the trustees? The answer is, I know some current trustees. I knew some trustees at the time. And in the course of my career, I, of course, knew many of those trustees. The Princeton administration, that is to say, I believe the president has, and sure, everything I say is necessarily biased, but I believe that any reasonable watcher of Princeton will tell you that this is true. The president has worked very hard to fill slots in the trustees with people who are going to do his bidding. Yeah, I think there are a few current trustees who don't entirely fit that mold, and that's great. But there are, I don't know, 40 odd, I don't even remember what the number is, but it's a lot of trustees, and most of them are, as is perfectly well known, rubber stampers. We have at least one person in the audience who is on the board of the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. an organization that I am also affiliated with, and that's an organization that pays a great deal of attention to what it is that trustees do or do not do. And so as for your last question, namely, is there any chance in hell that things are going to get better? There are people probably even in the room who can answer that better than I can. Again, that's going to be a case-by-case basis. There is increasing pressure from the public on trustees to do their job, but that's because there's increasing pressure from the public on universities, broadly speaking, to do their job. Whether in the coming years trustees are going to play, at least at elite universities, a more interesting role than they currently do, I think remains to be seen. I'm not optimistic about that, but the situation can hardly be worse now than it is most places. Over to Amy Wax to tell us about trustees at the University of Pennsylvania. Did that answer your questions?
It did, yes.
Good.
Amy?
Yeah, I'm going to just be a lot more pessimistic than even everyone on this committee. From my own experience in my university, I have not seen them give an inch, literally no retreat whatsoever from their hyper-partisan commitment to DIE, the narrowness of the Overton window. I'm going by, because most of my colleagues don't talk to me, a series of webinars that was put on by my university of how do we meet the challenge and the threat of the current moment. Now, maybe they put stooges up there who are not representative, but I listened to all of them, and there was not one single reservation expressed about what the university is doing, about its wonderfulness, about its unalloyed and unqualified excellence and its boon to mankind, to America, to the taxpayers, to the citizens. I mean, it was just unbelievable. Okay, and then when a member of the audience finally put a question to the panels about DIE in the very last session, John Holloway, who's the president of Rutgers, who happened to be a guest invitee on the panel, said, well, I don't know what people are fussing about. I mean, they keep saying that DIE is about equal results. Well, that's just false. It's about equal opportunity, which, of course, we know is an out-and-out lie. The guy is gaslighting us. I mean, the sneakiness and the dishonesty of what is being said by the powers that be at the university today is, to me, truly stunning. They have no compunction about lying to the American public, about lying to the university community. They lied in my own case, brazenly, and they continue to do it. It's, to me, very disappointing, and I still can't believe that a lot of it is going on. Let me say one more thing. The effect of these diversity statements, the diversity mandates, the narrow Overton window on students is something that hasn't come up. And I think it's really important. Jennifer Roback-Morse is an economist who talks about welfare as an occasion for sin. DIE for students is an occasion for sin. And what do I mean by that? I'll tell an anecdote to illustrate it. I have a student who comes from Sri Lanka, who is a self-styled conservative. He currently works for a think tank in Washington, a conservative think tank. He was in my conservatism class. He asked me to do a recommendation for him for a foreign service program, and then he sent me a diversity statement. Can you go over this for me? And I emailed him back. I said, I thought these were illegal. Like, why are you doing this? And he said, well, it's optional, and I figured it might help me. Right? So he's been co-opted. Can you blame the guy? He figures I can take advantage of this, and it's disappointing to me. It's an occasion for sin. It's a temptation to feed the beast, and these students continue to feed the beast because what we have not just in the universities, but in other institutions, is an overarching problem that all of these discussions are attempting to get at, and none of them really do. And that is the almost total and complete ideological capture of our universities. And you say, oh, there's actually diversity of thought. Well, maybe among the students, but they have no leadership, they have no leverage, there is no power center within the university for that diversity of thought. There is none. Okay, I mean zero, literally zero. And my experience exemplifies this. I am one of the few people I know who actually comes out and in plain English expresses forbidden thoughts. And they have gone berserk. I mean, they see me as this ridiculous threat. My students laugh about it because they say, oh no, she's just a little funny old lady who sits in her office. But very, very upsetting to them that anybody would dare to do that. So, I mean, this is still going on.
I'll jump in. It's particularly on the last part and loop it back to DEI statements too. One thing that I've often thought about is, okay, we need to get rid of ideological screening tools, but like you said, there is already such a monoculture in the academy that, okay, we were maybe screening out 70% of conservatives prior to DEI statements. You get DEI statements, now you're able to screen out 90, 95. We get back to not having those anymore. We're still screening out so many people who don't hold the conventional views or kind of kowtow to whatever the prevailing orthodox is on campus. So I'm optimistic about things getting better once these are gone writ large, but there's still a ton of work to do to restore balance and freedom of thought and students speaking out. I routinely see and hear stories from students who don't feel comfortable. And when it's on the faculty front, in my faculty survey, the number one thing that faculty said they couldn't talk about was diversity, equity, inclusion on campus and DEI issues. So if people don't feel comfortable, that's not constructive. But so that's just on that part, but I'll let the others chime in on other elements.
I will just agree that viewpoint diversity remains a huge problem. It has made very little progress. And I think it's at the root of a lot of the disconnect between the American society overall and many campuses. Students, including progressive students, deserve to be exposed to a full range of thinking about our social controversies. And when you have a bubble, people tend to become more and more radicalized. I think that's at the root of a lot of the distrust. Ultimately, is this, if it's a 20-1 on a political ratio, that feels a lot different day to day than a 3-1 or a 2-1, which is what it was in the middle of the last century. It's an area where we're now starting to see some deliberate action in state legislatures and other places, but it's going to take acknowledging it as a problem and then a whole bunch of creative work to try to get that back. That's also partly why I think some new institutions could help. But I did not wake up this morning and say that I would try to defend the University of Pennsylvania to Professor Wax, and I'm not going to do that. What has gone on there and what you have dealt with is 100% unacceptable and appalling.
Well, you know, Amy, that of course I've written very sympathetically about you, and not just because you're my friend. I'm confident. I mean, you are, let's face it, an extreme case because you are a completely unfiltered person. Most people, very few people.
Unfiltered doesn't sound good.
You're like an old-fashioned Marlboro, candid. Okay. Forthright. I'm attempting only to use positive words because I have only positive feelings toward you, Amy. You know that. You are a very unusual case, though. The fact is that there are people on the faculty at Penn who agree with a lot of what you say, but they will not come out and say it. You may be so controversial, but you get very little of that. But to judge from what I know and from what other people in similar sorts of situations have experienced, there are all the whisperers who say, well, I can't publicly say, but. And this is the sort of thing that makes me extremely angry, but at the same time, not as pessimistic as some people in this room, because I believe that it is possible, once again, to get to those people and make them show just a little drop of courage here or there. I know.
The students, so I'm telling you, the students.
All of this is bad. Of course, all of this is bad.
Private
Of course not. This is all very, very bad indeed. But I don't believe that there are thousands of crazy true believers, Amy Wax is a witch sort of people out there. Most people don't fall into that category. And just getting a few of them to stop doing the whispers and actually speak up publicly would be a great boon. As I've said many, many times publicly, and I'm just going to say it again, having one person say something is well, it's better than nothing, but it's not great. Having two is better than twice one. Having three is better than three times. I don't know where the line is where the numbers start mattering a lot, but by the time you get to 5, that's a lot better than just 5 times 1. 10. A lot better than 10 times 1. I know this is the new math, but this is really true. When you start having just a few people who do it, they go out, the networks build, and you get more of them. It's staggering how little that is happening now, but let's all make it happen.